Hello, friends. Today I am delighted to be joined by Glenn McCarty. You may know him as the author of the Tumbleweed Thompson adventures and the Dead-Eye Dan novels. He teaches middle school English in Western New York, where he lives with his wife and children in a small town that's pretty much Mayberry. You may not realize I live in North Carolina, quite close to the town Mayberry is based on. But unfortunately, Don Knotts does not live near Glenn. He finds campfires and banjo music two of life's simple pleasures and pie. So, Glenn, would you just tell us here? There's like the official bio and introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your family.
Um, well, I have two boys who are now 16 and 14. And my wife and I both are teachers. And I've been an educator for over 20 years. I was briefly a journalist right after college. But ever since then, I've been teaching high school, middle school English and writing and a whole bunch of other things. And we are definitely fortunate that despite the fact that some of the year here in Western New York, it is kind of like it is today, which is about 10 degrees. For a lot of the year, summer and fall, it's great to be outdoors. And so we have definitely taken advantage of the fact that we both, as teachers, have the summers off and have tried in the summers just to kind of do as many outdoor rambling, going around adventures, hiking and being in creeks and swimming and taking some family road trips. And we've always as families been blessed to have some great adventures together where we can like this summer, for example, our family road trip took us right through probably your part of North Carolina because we went to Mount Airy, North Carolina. And sometimes with adventures, we've had some unexpected developments. But I would have to say that we play games together and definitely have a lot of laughing and a lot of good memories that we've made over the years. And I'm a reader. I love reading, and I think, you mentioned pie in the official bio, but I feel like I have to just echo that because it's one of life's pleasures.
Yeah, well, I have to ask if you have a particular favorite pie.
Oh man, I often answer coconut cream to that, which is sort of like not one of the classic pies, but I do love strawberry rhubarb as well.
Okay. Well, I have to, share a little dad joke humor. This is from my dad. We're from the South, so I not really so much now, but when I'm with my extended family, definitely the accent comes out. And so if you're ever with Southerners, you can say, "Why is my hand like a lemon pie? Because it's got my ring on it." So there's there's your little pie humor of the day.
I love it. That's so great.
Okay, so you mentioned you love to read, and of course, you are a storyteller and author yourself. I would love to hear your sort of history with reading, your storytelling past. Is that something that always captured your imagination as a child? Was there a particular book that originally kind of set you on this path of reading and telling stories?
I've always been a reader, and I think I've always been drawn to stories that were, I want to say, like warm and inviting. There was either a narrator, it was a first person story, or even, I mean, like there was a narrator who was a character, or even a third person narrator who just kind of in the early part of the story, you were made to feel welcome in whatever world it was. And I think that had a lot probably to do with the main character being someone that I just felt like I could really connect with. And I think going back almost all the way back to like middle elementary, like third grade, fourth grade. There were always books that I remember just making me feel that way. I think The Mouse and the Motorcycle and Ralph S. Mouse was one that just captivated me. I don't even really know exactly if I don't really want to analyze that too much because it was such a delightful book with just enough imagination, but really you cared so much for this little mouse. And I always loved the Homer Price Centerburg Tales books by Robert McCloskey, which were very small town boy adventure. I think they were sort of ancestors of the Tumbleweed Thompson books for sure, in the sense that they created this community and they gave this main character a chance to kind of like um, explore and become his own person through the process of some of the decisions that he was having to make, and sort of stepping a little bit outside of the boundaries that existed. And Narnia, of course. I mean, I know for a lot of people, the Narnia books were that way. They were so just vividly rendered and captivating in the way that they presented the world, especially the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But so many of them. I think the Dawn Treader book for me, which is probably my favorite of that series, was one that I just remember like that. I mean, like I've never been on a sailing ship, but I think that book will, for the rest of my life, make me want to, be on a sailing ship, have these adventures, go to these islands. And I think, excuse me, I do think that as I was talking about storytelling, I think as I was, younger, and then thinking about writing, that was always something that I just wanted to try to sort of like mimic it, in the same way that like you're trying to like try on your dad's shirt or your dad's shoes or something, like you just want to see what it fits like on you. And so it was always something that was just I wanted to do it. And I think, I got busy in high school, but I remember my senior year of college, my wife and I, she was an elementary education major and I was an English major. We both took a children's literature class together. And so there I was probably like 20, 21 years old. And I remember our professor was so great at like bringing out picture books and middle grade books, things that I hadn't thought about or seen in a long time. And especially as like an English major of literature, I had sort of moved into this other territory where you were talking about these really deep, complicated things. And then I remember just that was such an inviting experience to think that telling stories for young people was not only worthwhile, it was a very validating experience to take that class with him, but also I just was reminded of how like foundational and how your imagination is formed by the stories that you read when you're a young person. And that was probably the first big step in this idea of, I think I want to try to write novels for young people, because I just knew as I looked back on my experiences when I was a kid that there was just so much foundational exposure to beauty and truth and all these great thematic things, hard choices and sacrifice and friendship and forgiveness and bravery and all those things that you're getting to explore as a kid by reading these great books. I think definitely it was like, I think I want to do this. And not just I want to do it, but I feel like this is a really big calling, that someone can have.
Well, all of those books you mentioned that kind of captured your heart as a kid, Narnia, the Beverly Cleary books, Homer Price, they're these deceptively simple stories on the one hand, with such rich themes and ideas, right? That's why they've stood the test of time. I think about some family read-alouds we have enjoyed as a family, like Half Magic by Edward Eager. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but we read that one for the first time aloud as a family, and it's this very like kind of crazy, kooky story, right?
Yeah.
And then we finished it, and I said to my husband, I said, John, that book is really asking one of the big questions, like, what is a good life? Like, that's the theme of that book. Or, the Rats of Nim. It's like, what does it mean to be a good man? I mean, a good rat, but
Yeah.
really it's about what it means to
Sure.
be a good man, right? And so
Yeah.
you're never too old to read a great book. And sometimes I kind of like the children's books better. Maybe that's just me.
I think when you talk about deceptively simple, I think for me, what I've tried to do is create an opening, but also create a situation or a scenario that is very easy to get into, like to kind of step into that world without a lot of difficulty for a kid, like, the Mouse and the Motorcycle, like here's like a kid and here's a motel and here's a mouse and like, okay, I'm there, right? Like I don't need a lot of, it just doesn't require a lot. And I think that's very welcoming and very hospitable to readers, to young readers, especially, that getting into the story happens so naturally. And then once you're connected to a character and you're sort of traveling that path with them, you're experiencing all the things that they're experiencing, the horror of something breaking or something falling apart or even loss. I can't believe I didn't mention Where the Red Fern Grows, which was a huge book for me. And in fifth grade, our teacher read it aloud to us. And my wife actually in sixth grade, they read it, and she just finished that unit with her sixth graders. And so she still every year experiences that story. And I think, again, that it's, there's nothing very complicated about the premise to that book. I mean, it's basically growing up and learning to love and go through life with these two amazing dogs. Like, you're there, okay, but it's what you do with that can really be so instrumental in shaping someone's imagination.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I still remember sobbing when I read that book for the first time as a child. It was in public. It was in the realtor's office. My parents were there and I was like bawling uncontrollably. It was so embarrassing.
Yeah.
But that's what a good story will do, right?
Yeah.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about your own journey as a writer?
Yeah. So the Tumbleweed Thompson books, about 10 or 11 years ago, this is sometimes, we were talking about premises. Sometimes I've had other ideas for books that have never been published. They're just sort of unfinished manuscripts or unpublished manuscripts that the premise took a lot of sort of digging and discovery. And really, I still don't exactly remember exactly what, but I do know that the name Tumbleweed Thompson just sort of popped into my head. And then it sort of became some sort of, okay, I think it's going to be an Old West story, because I loved Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn as a kid. I didn't mention those either. We could do a whole podcast about just like, formative books, I think. And then it was just some questions, like what kind of kid would call himself Tumbleweed, like would give himself that nickname, right? And then it began, like I said, I had written a couple other manuscripts for young people that had been sort of submitted and gone through the process of publication, sending out to various people, and nothing had really come of them. And I think I sort of acknowledged that they weren't sort of where they needed to be. But Tumbleweed Thompson and Story Warren, the publisher, their stories have been together since the very beginning. All those years ago, it began as just a series of short stories that were published on the Story Warren website. And very episodic, which to me was very great. That's what I loved about like the Homer Price books is, they weren't necessarily one novel length plot. They were just a bunch of little vignettes in the life of Homer, and so I envisioned it as, they were happening consecutively, but they were just sort of several vignettes in the life of Eugene Appleton, the main character of the book, and this new kid that comes into his town and kind of turns his life upside down, who calls himself Tumbleweed Thompson. And I had written several of those, and then S.D. Smith, Sam Smith, and I were talking about it, and he said, I think you really should try it if you turn this into a Tumbleweed Thompson novel. And one thing led to another, and it didn't take that much editing for it to kind of move from a series of vignettes to still maintaining that spirit. That first Tumbleweed Thompson book, The Misadventured Summer Tumbleweed Thompson, does have that sort of vignette episodic spirit, but kind of woven through it is this, this sort of bigger, more significant, higher stakes plot, which involves some shady characters in town. And I think, once that Tumbleweed Thompson book existed, for me, I was super excited to kind of see what other stories I could tell from the world of Tumbleweed Thompson. And so that's where the Junction Tales collection came from. It was me, kind of like, okay, if Rattlesnake Junction, where this story takes place, is kind of like my Mayberry, like what do we know about the guys who hang out in the barbershop on Saturday morning? Like, what kind of stories are they telling around, just on a Saturday morning when they're sitting around chewing the fat? Or what about that place outside town they call Mosquito Ridge? Like, where'd it get its name? Like the kinds of things that if you're growing up in Rattlesnake Junction, you might have heard a story about that guy who has that herd of cattle, and all the other books, the Dead-Eye Dan books that you mentioned, and Junction Tales, have sort of just sprung out of the desire to just build this world that hopefully, kids who read the Tumbleweed Thompson books, kind of are drawn to the other stories, because in spirit they're similar, but they're maybe telling other corners of that world. Yeah.
That sounds really fun and just an adventure. And it makes me think of a word you used earlier where you talked about like wanting these to be hospitable places, books that you remember reading that made you feel welcome as a child. And I can kind of hear that as you're describing the way you want to write for children. I'm wondering if you can maybe go a little deeper and tell me what it is that you like about specifically writing stories for young people, or what it is you hope to do as an author with that audience.
Yeah, I think for me, stories for young people, there's a willingness and a spirit of openness. I think when I think about when my own boys were in that 10, 11, 12 age group. I mean, even now they're a little bit older than that, but there's an openness to, once you're into that world, into that book, of accepting and following, and there's such an openness to new ideas and new horizons. I know adventure, the kind of stories I like to tell often are adventure stories, and I know that for young people, new places, new experiences, reading about those in books is just the best. I mean, I mentioned Don Treader, like I think I so many different books that I read that were that age, that when I was that age specifically, were just exposing me to all these new places, real, fictitious, who knows if they even existed in my world, right? But just it broadens what you see of the world, and that's happening, in your inner life too. When you're that age, your conception of a lot of things is getting more complex and more nuanced. You're starting to ask some questions about some things that you maybe took for granted when you were a little bit younger. And I think that combination of what's happening as you're sort of seeing the world, I just love the idea of coming alongside a child and their family and saying, here's things that you're already thinking about, here's questions you're already asking. Let me just kind of provide, let me just help you with that a little bit. Here's something to think about, right? And I love, like some kind of those sort of ethical questions. In the first Tumbleweed book, there's several different questions that are asked of Eugene, the main character, sort of through his relationship with the town barber, Wendell, where he's maybe not for the first time, but he's having to really think deeply about, loyalty and how far, when you're loyal to someone and you believe in them, how far you're willing to go, to kind of help that person out. And that kind of is juxtaposed with Tumbleweed, who's kind of a rambler and has never really had that kind of loyalty. And so, I just love the idea of saying, here's this story, you're gonna live in this world for a little while, and hopefully when you come back, you kind of see your world a little differently. You're kind of thinking about the people that you interact with on a daily basis. You're kind of just thinking about them a little differently because of what you've experienced through the books that I've shared with you.
Well, there you're talking about really big, meaningful themes and ideas that you're approaching in your book, or in kind of causing children to think, or young people to think about a little differently. How do you balance also the humor and the fun? How do you kind of find that balance of humor and meaningful, deep themes in your writing?
Boy, Amy, that is me. That's just kind of where I live all the time, is like, I'm going to maybe, like, better for worse, right? I'm going to maybe have some thought that I'm like, wow. And then I'll get up and like stub my toe on something, right? And I'm just laughing at myself 4 seconds after I just had this thought that I'm like, I want to, I don't know. I mean, humor is just something that I feel like is very authentic. I've always kind of seen the world as a little bit of a comedy, in the sense that, like, just bizarre things are happening that you can't really explain. And I mean, I teach middle school, I teach 8th grade. So, like, bizarre things are often happening. But I think for me, humor isn't some sort of strategy as much as it is just kind of like a natural reflection of kind of what I see going on. Plus, I love reading and experiencing comedy and humor. I love stories that are funny, or movies, or television shows, or whatever. Even to the point of a little bit of the like silly, bizarre type humor. So I think I want that to be a part of, of the stories that I tell. I do also know that, like you mentioned, writing for young people, they love to laugh. I mean, like there's a silliness. I think silliness is very, very important. I take silliness very seriously.
I love that. It actually makes me think of that G.K. Chesterton quote. I'm going to paraphrase it. This is the Message translation, but it's something like angels are able to fly because they take themselves lightly. And I think sometimes we can take ourselves a little too seriously, especially, those of us who like to think deep thoughts, and there's maturity, but sometimes we can equate like maturity with just never cracking a smile or something. Like there is a sense in which, like you said, humor is a serious matter. Silliness can also be serious.
And that was a turning point, I think, as a parent. I don't know exactly where, I kind of picked up the idea that when I first was a dad, that my what was expected of me was to be sort of some sort of like Mount Rushmore type marble person, and I just kind of like, this was how I dispensed wisdom. And then I was very fortunate early on in my parenting. I'll never forget, actually, I'll give credit to these two gentlemen who are both funny, wise men. I went to a conference, the Hutchmoot conference, which is through the Rabbit Room, when my kids were very little, and I went to a little workshop panel with Randall Goodgame, from Slugs and Bugs, and SD Smith, and it was about being a dad. And they both, as leaders of the workshop, could have talked about parenting and being a father. And they both told stories that were both really funny and kind of embarrassing and self-deprecating about times that they had just kind of messed up as a dad. And I remember coming away from that being very impressed by them as guys, but also thinking, wow, like I can kind of just laugh at myself, and we as a family can laugh together. And it just took me right down off that pedestal as a parent. And it has become such a part of our family culture, humor and laughing together and looking back at, things we've gone through, stories, and laughing at those. I think I'm very grateful to have been given permission as a parent to make laughter a part of our home.
It's almost like I'm seeing a connection between humor and humility. So,
Yeah.
well, what are some ways that a family can really nourish a culture of stories in their home, in our home?
You said nurture a culture of books, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. A little like glitch or something there. I think probably I think your listeners are going to be amazing, literate, wonderful, earnest, creative people. And so I'm feeling a little like what I'm going to say is not going to be much help. Because
well, remember what Paul said. He's like, it's no trouble for me to say it again, and you need to hear it again. So that's how I feel. Remind us of what we know.
Yeah, for sure. I think culture of books, I mean, obviously presence is very important, like literal having them, right? Everywhere. Like we used to think that if one of our kids would sort of like trip or stumble and stick their hand out, they should like physically, there should be a book there, right? Like they're just kind of everywhere. So if you're just kind of sitting somewhere and you're not sure what to do, look to your left. Oh, look, there's a stack of books. Let me see if one of those looks interesting, right? We also, read-alouds were huge for us. I think I was so excited that from the very beginning, literally day one, all the way up until, probably, I'm not going to lie, my older son's a junior, halfway through his junior year of high school. I mean, we don't really do read-alouds with them anymore. But we had just a constant, like I was already thinking when we were in the middle of one of our evening read-alouds, what's the next thing going to be? What's the next thing going to be? And trying to find a way to sort of like, it's hard to say, try to communicate that in experiencing some of these books together, we as a family and them as individuals, we're all kind of stepping into this grand tradition of this particular book, like we're joining the people who have also experienced this story. And so it feels very significant, like, oh my gosh, this is cool. I get to experience Charlotte's Web, or I get to experience whatever. I think that experience of us kind of doing them together as read-alouds was really great. And like family road trips, there was always audiobooks. And I think, again, like doing voices, like the attempt, right? I mean, like, it's a shared experience. And I think when you're trying to create a family culture of anything, fill in the blank, I think having that shared experience is so powerful when we're all sort of together doing this thing, right? And even now, I mean, there's definitely times where I mentioned we don't kind of do the evening read aloud together. We're still, like the four of us will be in the same room all reading something, and so I think for us, that kind of togetherness has meant that we can refer back to that book that we were listening to on that trip, or that time we did that read aloud.
Yeah, I have those memories from my own childhood, and I enjoyed so much those shared audiobooks on car trips as a family, or just, even back when all my kids were little and I would be driving, everyone was together when you'd go to one person's, class or another activity, because no one was old enough to stay home alone. And so we were able to share so many stories together all the time, and it's gotten a lot trickier now. I have 5 children, and by the time this airs, they'll probably be from like 10 to 20. So a big age range. And of course, those older ones are independent, like your teens. They have activities and other things. It just makes it logistically harder to all be together. But over the past year, my husband has actually, I do a lot of reading with the kids as part of our school stuff, but my husband has taken the opportunity to just have a read aloud book that he does with individual children.
Mm.
So it's different from when we all used to be together. That's just not feasible a lot of the time right now. But he'll take one-on-one time with a child, and they're each reading a different book. And I thought, for a while I was kind of grieving the loss of that regular family, all 7 of us together read aloud time. But there's something really special about that kind of unique one-on-one experience they're sharing together as well. So,
Definitely.
yeah. Well, do you have a favorite particular memory from a read aloud with your family? Or an
Um,
audiobook, that's kind of a read aloud.
yeah. So the first one that comes to mind is going to fit within this theme of like sort of a little self-deprecating. There was one year, and I don't remember how old my kids were at the time. There was one year where I decided, we talked about in advance that this coming calendar year was going to be the year of Lord of the Rings. And so we started probably January 1st, I would say. And we read Fellowship of the Ring, actually, I think it was literally like one of those giant 3-in-1 volumes. We finished that one, went on to Two Towers, finished that one, went on to Return of the King. And aside from just the accomplishment factor, it was amazing, right? I think my older son had read some of this trilogy. I'm not sure he had read. I think he had maybe gotten into the second book. I'm not really sure. Anyway, that was a fantastic memory. The boys like to tease me about the fact that when we got to the very end of Return of the King and I was reading about the Grey Havens, that I had to sort of stop because I was like, getting emotional, tearing up, even to the point of like crying and unable to read for just the beauty of what he's describing there at the end. They just like to tease me about how Daddy couldn't get through the end of Return of the King without crying. But there's really something about like reading something aloud that changes your experience of it than just if you're reading it quietly. It's just hard to say. You slow down, the way you interact with stuff changes. it's like it is kind of a different experience from reading it to yourself if you're reading aloud, especially if you're reading aloud with like people you love, and then people who love you haven't read it before, and then when you're like, there are such amazing things in this. I'm so glad I get to share this with you. I think all of that was happening, and I'm sort of prone to being emotional anyway. So like all that was happening, and it was just like it was too much.
There are some books like that. Like if you haven't had a book where you have to like pass it back and forth from parent to parent to try to get through the hard part,
Right.
have you really been a reader yet?
Yeah, that's right. Good question.
Well, what is a piece of advice you would give to parents maybe whose children they're wanting to inspire them with creativity? Maybe they're interested in writing, or they think, "Oh, I think I would love to inspire this sort of creative thinking." Do you have any advice for those parents?
Um, I think one thing that I hopefully have gotten better at is just kind of meeting your children where they are in terms of their interests and their path. And that's a tricky balance, but I think I'm a very deliberate kind of person, educator, like have a curriculum plan and all those things. And so I think there were many times where I, especially maybe my wife as well, but probably me, both of us were sort of like very much like curriculum focused when it came to like creative pursuits that sort of existed outside of the curriculum. And so we had an agenda and a plan. And sometimes that made for, like tension, and sometimes it made for like the sort of shutting down of creativity. And so I think we tried, as sort of we learned from some of those experiences, and we kind of just said, whether it's the thing you want to write about, or the type of medium you want to use, or even like the way you want to go about doing it, just kind of like waiting, observing, let's see what's happening here, let's not impose too early, let's just kind of let this organically happen. And just kind of, I mean, and it's so ironic because I think for me, I mentioned earlier that like when I was in college, I felt sort of funneled towards a certain kind of literature, and I was a little frustrated that there wasn't as much openness or acceptance to like writing for kids or anything like that, right? That I kind of made almost, I wouldn't say I made the same mistake, but I kind of maybe shut down some creativity because I wasn't just sort of meeting someone where they were, or meeting one of my kids where they were, and saying, "Oh, that's really cool, that thing that you're doing. Let's sort of see how we can kind of maybe like explore that more, and see how we can." I guess it's like nurturing versus like controlling or something.
Yeah. It's kind of like I remember when my kids were young and we would go to like one of the craft activities at the library, right? And there'd be some art project, some very creative art project that the facilitator had decided was going to be the craft project. And so I would just sit there and I'd let my kids like do it. It didn't look real good. I was just going to throw it away later. Don't tell them that. But, I just sort of let them follow this. And then you would see the parents that were just like, no, no, that's not where the little googly eye goes. The googly eye goes here. Here, just let me glue it. And
Yeah.
just basically making this perfect product for their child, and not giving the child just a freedom. It's a directed freedom, I guess. But that ability, that space to just try something and maybe even be bad at it, which kind of comes too with just like time and space as well. I think if
Yeah.
everything's filled, there's no time to explore.
And make mistakes and all that. I mean, creativity is messy. I mean, literally, metaphorically, it's going to involve a lot of stops and starts, and changes of plans and all that stuff. And I think that's easier said than done, especially when there's factors that you're sort of like, oh my gosh, time, and oh my gosh, this, and but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just give my kids a lot of tape and cardboard and like, there you go.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not
Yeah.
really a hands-on creative mom, but I'm a very much, hey, feel free to use the tape and the cardboard and throw it away when you're done.
Yeah. Well, hey, materials. You can't make anything about materials, so it's important.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. I can't wait to share it with the listeners and viewers. But here at the end, I want to ask you the questions that I'm asking all my guests this season. And so the first is just, what are you personally reading right now?
I am personally reading. We talked about sharing books together. I'm actually reading a fantasy book that my 16-year-old recommended to me. It's by James Inslington. Australian fantasy writer, and he's the author of a book called The Will of the Many. But this is his previous trilogy, and it's the first book in that series, and I believe it's called The Shadow of What Was Lost. He's very inspired by Brandon Sanderson, and I don't read a lot of high fantasy. It's probably the one major genre that I don't just instantly go to. And so my son was rereading this trilogy, and the books are like each like 700 pages. And he was just like, he was engrossed for a second time. And so I just thought, you know what, if he loves this series so much, like I got to get in there and see what this is all about. And it's enjoyable. I'm really enjoying it. But yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
I will have to look that one up for my teens. They enjoy Brandon Sanderson and some of those, epic fantasy books. So it sounds like it would be up their alley for sure. Well, what would be your best tip for a family? Maybe a day seems to be going all wrong. What would be your best tip for turning around a bad day?
Um, I think I would probably say a talking about like acknowledging it, like talking about the elephant in the room. I think I don't know. I feel like I'm sort of like maybe I'm trying to fit themes together here, but this idea, like we were talking about, like controlling versus organic, allowing creativity to happen. I think just sort of like acknowledging that things are not going as planned, and I think activity sometimes can be a way, like whether that's dancing, music, like changing the atmosphere of the room, sometimes can do that, whether it's like I said, putting on music or something like that. I think, you know changing the atmosphere of the room, like trying to find a way to acknowledge this is happening. We're not, we're all whatever. We all woke up in a bad mood. Like somebody did something and I can't let it go, whatever. But I think like changing the dynamic sometimes can be a way, or even like, activity. I mean, like trying to find something to get involved in that can sort of take your mind off of things. And I mean, of course, laughter, but you can't always summon, you can't always summon laughter at a drop of a hat, But I think anytime that we're laughing, something about like we talked about humility, you and I talked about humility, but it also just sort of lets down our defenses a little bit. And I think, sometimes that can be something that's in the way of harmony, family togetherness, is like that sort of defensive or that pride or whatever it is, even if you've been hurt by someone, if someone did something or said something that really bothered you and it was in the morning, but now it's the afternoon and you're still not letting go of it. If there's a way to just, like humor can do that. It can kind of lower everything, just lower the tension.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's such good advice just to acknowledge it, to say, like, sometimes I'm like, mom is really having a bad day. Like, maybe I didn't sleep well, or, there's some really hard things going on, and I am just really struggling. Like, acknowledging that to our children, again, we're connecting it. It's kind of like humility again, right? But
Yeah.
it's giving them also the freedom to share their own thoughts and feelings, like if they're having a hard day, and it doesn't excuse then, being grumpy with each other. But it kind of enables us to be like, hey, this is part of the human experience. And what can we do to get past this? And that's really, really good advice. Yeah.
Yeah, just not feeling like everything has to be buttoned up all the time, and I found that like you just said, that sentence, sort of like confessing that, there's been times where there's been such powerful sympathy from my kids. Like they'll just sort of, kind of like walk up and put a little hand on my shoulder, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like that was everything. Like just admitting, oh man, like I'm going to say it. I'm going to say that I'm not in a good place right now. And just instantly they've been so willing to, that's okay. It's all right. Like, because I think we all admit we all are like that, but we don't always bring it up to the forefront. We just kind of like, okay, let's get through this. Let's get past this.
Yeah. Our pastor recently preached on Psalm 139. And I think the title of the sermon was An Invitation to Be Known. Because, of course, in there, the psalmist is talking about how God knows him before he even like says the words, right? Truly known. And our pastor, was just reminding us that the Lord knows us. And that's also why we can truly be known by one another, right? We don't have to be hidden or have that facade. And where better to start that than with our children and our families, for sure.
It sets a really, like you said, it sets a really powerful precedent. Like it's okay to do this, and you're modeling that sort of openness and vulnerability, that we always are saying we want that in other people, but like, okay, I got to go first,
Yeah.
sometimes, right?
Well, Glenn, where can people find you and your books all around the internet?
Yeah, so I mean, my name, Glenn McCarty, Glenn with two N's.com, is a great place to start. There's links to the books and a little bit more about them. You can sign up for my email newsletter there, where every so often you just kind of get a little bit of what's going on, my book projects. And the Tumbleweed Thompson books are available at the Story Worn store. And the other ones are Amazon.
Yeah. And I will have links to your books and your website, all those things, in the show notes for this episode at humilityanddoxology.com. I encourage you guys to check out his book, check out Glenn's website, and tell a friend about this episode that you think they would enjoy. Leave a rating and review if you're listening in your podcast player, or subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And I look forward to chatting with you again.